Hi folks, my name's Gheeotine, and I'll be honest, I kinda want to switch gears after last week's video was really full of negativity.
Sometimes I have sentiments that I have to exercise, and my thoughts on Epic and Fortnite were definitely within that category. I still stand by every word, but this week I decided that I needed to counter that anger and vitriol by going to something decidedly more positive. As repeat viewers also know, I recently got into PC building. I'm now likely in the wind down of my honeymoon phase with my new hobby, but that's likely due in part to the fact that the computer I'll be featuring today is a machine that I overtly made to be a matter of nostalgic indulgence. Let me reveal to you a build I'm calling the Alternate Dimension. Alright. I get it. It may not look like much. In fact, from the outward appearance, this looks like nothing more than a Dell Dimension 2400. That's a computer that released in 2003, the same year that Call of Duty had its first entry. However, once you start looking around the back panel, you may notice a few details that give away the hardware inside. That power supply doesn't match the rest of the back of the case. The Dell Dimension 2400 didn't have massive antennas sticking out the back. The 2400 didn't have HDMI display ports and DVI plugs going all the way down the PCIe slots. Yes, you would be correct on all of that. But you might reasonably ask, why did you build a machine out of this relic's shell? Well, that one's easy. I fondly remember a Dell Dimension being the family computer that I shared use of. I didn't do much gaming on it, being mostly a console user at the time, but I also remember watching early episodes of Naruto on YouTube around the same time, but I digress. So with the shell explained, let's discuss some prep and the parts that eventually made it inside. Anyone who's worked with older hardware will tell you, ventilation is a bitch. As time has progressed, components have been using more power and in turn have been generating more heat. So in the early days, many PCs could get away with just a basic CPU cooler and maybe a single fan or two. These days, not so much. This case originally only had a single exhaust fan that was oriented around the CPU, and otherwise was entirely passive for internal cooling. Step 1, fix that. As the case was, there was no place to easily install an intake fan, so I made a place. The easiest spot was to free up where they wanted you to install a hard drive. Out came the cage, in went the fan. Next, I decided to take passive cooling and ramp it up to 11. A liberal application of a hole saw and a basic understanding of thermodynamics means that the case should have enough access to air to not cook itself. With the prep now established, let's move on to the reveal for the case. Okay, I'll acknowledge that some probably have no idea what they're looking at, so let's start with the motherboard, the foundation of the remainder of the build. This was actually very specific and ruled by constraints of the case. You see, the Dell Dimension 2400 is small and does not fit a standard ATX-size motherboard, but something called micro ATX. This by itself would have been fine, but I wanted to incorporate another feature that can be best described as an option of moderately performative indulgence, and at worst, a utility of uselessness. That option being SLI, or Scalable Linked Interface. To the layman, SLI allows you to hook up two NVIDIA graphics cards with identical make and models together, then using a bridge connector, they share processing power to improve the graphics capability of your PC and your games. Not every game utilized the feature, and to my knowledge they are no longer making games that support SLI, but that doesn't mean there's not an already well-established library that can do it. Now, we'll get back to the motherboard in a moment, but this is probably the best time to focus on the graphics cards, and quite frankly, the case and graphics cards were the centerpieces that this build was focused around, and for the build, those cards were two NVIDIA PNY GTX 960 XLR8 Edition 4GB graphics cards. Why those, you might ask? Well, for the sake of expedience and pacing, it had a sentimental spot as one of the first GPUs I ever bought, long before I had any idea about PC building. Got it? Okay, moving on. Since the GTX 960 was released in 2015, 9 years ago by the way, it can be considered at best moderately to modestly powerful, which means that while it can play a fair number of modern games, it wouldn't make much sense to build a high-end machine and instead focus on hardware parity. So, moving back to the motherboard and compatibility, I decided I would aim for the peak of 4th generation Intel processors with the i7-4790K. For reference, we're currently on the 14th generation. The 4790K was a beast of its time, and it's still fairly capable by modern standards, but nowhere near the pinnacle of performance anymore. With that in mind, the options were fairly narrow. I needed something that fit the micro ATX form factor, supported SLI, and had an LGA 1150 socket, the one that supports the 4790K. With those parameters, it was fairly easy to find the Asus Maximus Gene line of motherboard, and I opted for the Gene 6. I could have gone with the Gene 7, but those were fairly more expensive, with the main substantive difference being M.2 support, which would have been nice, but I didn't need by any stretch. With that all decided and acquired, it was just a matter of filling out the rest of the machine. I had a 32GB kit of DDR3 1600MHz RAM kicking around, as well as a Corsair 750W power supply. In fact, the only part I really needed was storage at that point, which I took to eBay to find and came out with a 2TB Western Digital Red SATA SSD for about $50. Actually, I would like to take a moment to indulge in a side tangent to discuss the CPU cooler. In and of itself, there's nothing terribly extraordinary about it. It's the Cooler Master Hyper T20. I initially ran a stock Intel cooler, but the idle temps were just a little higher than I'd be comfortable with, so I elected for this. It had a reduced form factor, but promoted decent crossflow, and most importantly, because I didn't want to have to disassemble a motherboard from the case all over again, it had pop mounts, saving a fair amount of potential labor and grief. Unfortunately, I ended up ordering not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 of these fucking things. Not because it was of poor quality or arrived broken or anything, but apparently these things are starting to become scarce. At least at reasonable prices or outside of China. The first 2 ended up getting cancelled because they either couldn't find them in inventory or they got lost in transit. By the time I ordered the 3rd, I was being stubborn and wanted the damn thing on principle. Eventually I got it and installed it and ordered another one in case that one goes kaput. However, in my zeal to get it in, I forgot to remove the protective plastic from the cooler and the CPU began to thermal throttle when I booted it up. Eventually I realized my fuck up and there was no permanent damage other than my ego. Okay, tangent over. As a final touch, I attempted, with the use of adapters, to get the original IDE disk drive running. No such luck, I'm afraid, but since I'd been hoarding components, I had a working one with a SATA hookup, so that was an easy upgrade. With Windows installed, I was left with one question. What can the alternate dimension do? Well, I'm pleased to say that the footage currently on screen was captured on the machine. It may not be able to play the absolute pinnacle of hardware-intensive games, but of the games I've tested so far, the only one that outright would not run was Metro Exodus, and given how many games are out there that are well below that threshold for hardware requirements, I am quite content. The alternate dimension is now being used as a gaming machine and media hub in my bedroom. So, if nothing else, for aspiring PC builders out there, let this video illustrate 2 things. First, don't think you need the latest and greatest hardware to make a decent gaming machine. Second, make the machine that you want to make. If you have the means, don't be afraid to indulge in niche passion projects. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I just received a shipment of hard drives. Hey, thanks for sticking around all the way to the end. Remember that I give away Steam keys with my regular weekly uploads, and all you have to do to enter is leave a comment and have contact info on your YouTube profile. But as always, thanks for watching and keep your head on your shoulders.